Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, let's just say get ready for a wild ride.
Oh yeah, this one is intense.
It's a gripping personal story, a real medical crisis, and your sources really went all out on the details. We've got a European adventure, a sudden illness, a race against time, and honestly, it's a story of survival against all odds.
What really struck me was the contrast. It starts with this image of youthful energy and just like normalcy.
I know, right?
And that makes the plunge into crisis all the more impactful.
Yeah, totally. We're transported to Belgium, where we meet this 16-year-old girl living a pretty vibrant life. International school, sports after class, a loving family, and a real passion for running. She even logs hours every day around this scenic lake near her home.
That detail about her fitness level, it might actually come into play later. You know how studies show that having a strong baseline of physical health can make a big difference in recovery from serious illness?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it sort of speaks to her resilience, even before this whole ordeal began.
Okay, so she's got this softball tournament coming up in Germany. Life seems pretty great, but then, bam, everything changes.
I mean, it's pretty sudden.
But even before that, there's this one detail that jumped out at me. She mentions having memory gaps from that weekend in Germany.
Oh, yeah. It's a little creepy.
Yeah, almost like foreshadowing before any symptoms even appear.
It's a bit unsettling.
Right.
And then, seemingly out of nowhere, she's hit with this blinding headache, a stiff neck, and then sensitivity to sunlight so bad she's tearing up in her history class.
Oh, wow.
Imagine that, trying to focus on the past when your present is going completely haywire.
I can't even imagine. So at this point, she decides to skip softball practice and rest. She has no idea how serious things are about to get. Then there's this, totally random event that becomes super important. Her family friends, Aunt Max and Uncle Gene, are visiting from Louisiana.
And it's purely coincidental that Aunt Max loses her voice and has an appointment with their shared American doctor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this totally insignificant event becomes, totally pivotal in the story.
It really makes you wonder, how many tiny moments in our lives shape the bigger picture?
That really does, right?
Okay, so overnight, the narrator's condition plummets. We're talking leg cramps so bad she has to crawl to her parents' room, a fever spiking, chills, dehydration. It's terrifying.
And there's this one moment where her dad tries to massage her legs like he always did for growing pains, and the touch that used to soothe her, it now causes excruciating pain.
Oh, that's awful.
And sadly, their doctor advises them to wait until morning for the appointment, unknowingly delaying what would become critical treatment.
So morning comes and she can barely even get ready for the doctor.
Yeah, it's like her skin feels too tight to move.
She even needs her younger sister's help just to get dressed and down the stairs.
And on the drive to the doctor, she experiences this unsettling out-of-body sensation. It's like her consciousness is, detaching from her body.
Wow, that's a little freaky.
It makes me think about those moments in extreme situations when our perception of reality shifts, almost as a coping mechanism.
Yeah, that's deep. I mean, I get carsick, but this is another level.
Totally.
So they get to the doctor and things escalate quickly, right?
Exactly. The doctor sees this alarming bruising on her legs and immediately sends her to the ER, suspecting bacterial meningitis.
Oh, okay. So for me and our listeners, can you explain what meningitis is?
Sure. So meningitis is an infection of the membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it can be really serious, even fatal, if it's not treated quickly.
That sounds scary.
Yeah, it is. So what happens at the ER? Well, as luck, or maybe fate would have it, the ER chief physician, Dr. Jean-Louis Vincent, happens to be at the hospital.
Really?
Yeah, he was actually on vacation, but he had stopped by to pick something up. He hears the narrator's cries of pain and decides to examine her.
Wow, what are the chances? Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Right. And Dr. Vincent, recognizing the urgency, skips the usual spinal tap to save time and starts immediate treatment for bacterial meningitis.
Wow, so he's basically going with his gut, trusting his expertise.
He is, and it likely saves her life.
Okay, but how do you even treat bacterial meningitis?
It involves this very carefully balanced combination of medications.
It's like a regular cocktail, but for fighting infection.
Exactly. You need antibiotics to kill the bacteria, but you also need steroids to reduce inflammation and fluids to prevent dehydration. The challenge is that too much of one drug can harm other organs.
That's intense. I'm guessing the family is going through a lot at this point.
Absolutely. Dr. Vincent has had this very difficult conversation with her father and aunt, explaining that she might not survive the night.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, imagine that feeling, the weight of that uncertainty. They decide to call Uncle Gene, who has the heartbreaking task of breaking the news to the narrator's mother, who's at home with the younger sister.
Wow, this is just like heart-wrenching. So much happening at once.
It really is a scene filled with raw emotion and the terrifying possibility of loss. And throughout all of this, the narrator is in and out of consciousness, completely unaware of the battle being waged for her life.
This is heavy stuff. But she survives the first night, right?
She does.
We know she makes it, but how? I guess we'll have to find out in part 2.
Yeah, she makes it through that first night, which is a pretty big deal in itself.
Right.
But her journey is far from over.
Of course.
She spends the next 2 weeks in intensive care. Her life's still hanging in the balance.
I bet those 2 weeks just felt like an eternity for her family. Waiting and hoping while the doctors do everything they can.
Absolutely. And during that time, there are moments when it seems like all hope is lost. She goes into cardiac arrest, not once, but twice,
Oh my God.
requiring resuscitation and defibrillation.
So that means her heart actually stopped beating.
It does. It means her heart stopped, and they had to use electric shocks to restart it.
That's terrifying. So she's fighting for her life, but what's happening inside her head during all this?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, she wakes up from this coma, but she has very few memories of what happened. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
And the pieces she does have are pretty terrifying. She's wrapped in bandages from head to toe, hooked up to machines, and everyone around her is overjoyed that she's alive. She even thinks to herself, "Have you seen me? I'm basically a mummy. Why is everyone so happy?"
I mean, as someone who hates going to the dentist, I can only imagine the disorientation and fear of waking up like that. It must have been just incredibly overwhelming.
Absolutely. And her father, he's trying to explain things without overwhelming her.
Right.
So he starts by just focusing on the 5-week coma and the fact that she was so ill that, like, her body was literally breaking down.
Yeah.
He explains that doctors had to, like, perform surgery to remove damaged tissue, which is why she's covered in bandages. But even with this explanation, there's this underlying sense that there's, like, a much deeper, more traumatic story that's not being revealed just yet.
It's like a mystery unfolding in slow motion. She's alive, but what does that even mean at this point? What kind of life can she have after going through something like that?
Those were questions that kind of linger throughout her recovery process. And as she slowly regains her strength, she also starts to piece together, like, the events that led to her crisis. We learn about her incredibly active lifestyle, running for hours each day, playing sports, going to school. It's a stark contrast to her current state of immobility.
It really highlights the suddenness and severity of her illness. One day, you're a healthy, active teenager, and the next, you're fighting for your life in a hospital bed.
Exactly. And then the story takes us back to that fateful day when everything changed. It started like any other day school, softball practice, hanging out with friends. She was even excited about the upcoming tournament in Germany. No indication that anything was wrong.
But looking back, there were those subtle clues, right? Like the memory gaps from the tournament weekend.
Precisely. It's as if her body was already trying to tell her something wasn't right. And then on Monday, after returning from Germany, the symptoms hit. At first, it was just a headache and some stiffness in her neck. But then during her history class, she experienced this, like, extreme sensitivity to sunlight.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was so intense that it brought her to tears.
It's amazing how a seemingly small detail like that can be so powerful in conveying the sudden shift in her experience. She goes from feeling normal to being completely debilitated by this sensitivity to light.
It speaks to how quickly things can change when dealing with a serious illness. And at this point, she still had no idea what was happening to her. She just knew she didn't feel well enough for softball practice. So she went home to rest, hoping it was just a passing bug.
Right. And this is where the timing of everything becomes incredibly significant. Remember her family friends, Aunt Max and Uncle Gene, who were visiting from Louisiana? Well, Aunt Max, who happens to be a medical professional, lost her voice and needed to see a doctor.
Right. It's a complete coincidence, but it ends up being, like, a life-saving one.
Wow.
Because the narrator decided to join Aunt Max for her doctor's appointment the next morning, which meant she'd be seen by a doctor much sooner than she would have otherwise.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable example of how seemingly unrelated events can converge in such a powerful way.
It makes you wonder how many times those kinds of, like, seemingly random events have shaped our own lives, right? So that night, as the family is settling in with their guests, things take a terrifying turn for the worse.
They do. The narrator wakes up with excruciating leg cramps, a fever of 106 degrees, chills, and she's desperately dehydrated. Her parents, despite their growing concern, follow the doctor's advice and wait until morning for the appointment. It's a decision that likely haunted them as the night went on, and her condition continued to deteriorate.
You know, I've been in situations where I've second-guessed medical advice, and it's agonizing. The not knowing, the fear, it's incredibly difficult to navigate. So as the night progresses, how does her condition change?
Well, she describes feeling like her skin is too tight, like she's trapped inside her own body. She needs her younger sister's help just to get dressed and down the stairs. And on the drive to the doctor's office, she experiences that out-of-body sensation again. It's like her mind is trying to protect itself from the overwhelming reality of what's happening.
It's fascinating how the mind responds to trauma and physical stress. It makes me think about like the mind-body connection and how interconnected they truly are.
Absolutely. And when they finally arrive at the doctor's office, it becomes immediately clear that this is no ordinary illness. The doctor sees the bruising on her legs and immediately sends her to the ER, suspecting bacterial meningitis.
And that's when they encounter Dr. Vincent, right? What a stroke of luck or maybe destiny.
Yeah. Dr. Vincent, the ER chief physician, just happened to be at the hospital that day. He was on vacation, but had stopped by to pick something up. When he heard the narrator's cries of pain, he immediately took charge. He recognized the urgency of the situation and made the quick decision to skip the spinal tap, which would have confirmed the meningitis diagnosis, and start treatment right away.
That kind of decisiveness in a crisis is incredible. It makes you wonder what might have happened if he hadn't been there.
It's impossible to know for sure, but his presence undoubtedly made a significant difference. And even with Dr. Vincent's expertise, the narrator's situation remained incredibly precarious. Remember that medical cocktail we talked about earlier? Well, he had to constantly adjust the dosages, walking a tightrope between fighting the infection and keeping her organs functioning.
It sounds like an incredibly delicate and stressful process. I'm assuming this is also when he had to have that difficult conversation with the family about the possibility that she might not survive.
Yes, that's right. He had to be honest with them about the severity of her condition and the very real possibility that she might not make it through the night. It's hard to fathom the emotional turmoil her family must have experienced in that moment.
It's heartbreaking, really. But hold on, we know she does make it through that night. So what happens next? I guess we'll have to find out in part 3. It's amazing she pulled through that first night. But we left off with her still in intensive care. So what happened next?
Well, those next 2 weeks were pretty rough. I mean, it was touch and go for a while there.
Yeah.
A real roller coaster for her and her family.
I bet those 2 weeks felt like a lifetime.
Absolutely. And during that time, things got really scary a couple times. Like, she went into cardiac arrest, not once, but twice.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, requiring, resuscitation and defibrillation.
Hold on. So for those of us who don't speak medical jargon, what exactly does that mean?
It means her heart actually stopped beating,
Oh, wow.
and the medical team had to use, like, electric shocks to restart it.
That's terrifying. But what's remarkable is that even with all this fear and uncertainty, her family remained united.
Right. Their support and love for her during those 2 weeks was incredible. They really understood that their presence and strength were so important to her recovery.
It's a powerful testament to the healing power of, love and human connection. But what about her? What was her experience like as she started to recover?
Well, it wasn't easy. When she finally regained consciousness and started to understand what had happened, she had to grapple with the fact that her life would never be quite the same.
I can only imagine waking up after weeks in a coma with barely any memory of what happened. That must have been so disorienting.
It was. And not just mentally, but physically, too. She was incredibly weak. She had to relearn basic things like walking and talking.
Wow. It's a reminder that even after surviving something so traumatic, the journey back to like a sense of normalcy can be long and challenging.
It can. But what's inspiring about her story is that she never gave up. She faced every obstacle head on. She was determined to reclaim her life.
It's a real testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the incredible resilience we can find within ourselves when faced with adversity.
It is. And you know what's really interesting? Even though she went through so much pain and suffering, she never let bitterness consume her.
That's incredible. Most people would be like understandably angry and resentful after such an experience.
I know, right? She could have easily focused on everything she'd lost, but instead, she chose to focus on what she still had. She found gratitude in the smallest things, like the ability to breathe on her own or feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, we always have a choice. We can choose to dwell on the negative, or we can choose to find the light.
Exactly. And by choosing to find the light, she not only healed herself, but she inspired everyone around her too.
It's a beautiful reminder that even when life throws us a curveball, we can emerge from the experience stronger and more resilient than before.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly moving. We've explored the fragility of life, the power of hope, and just the remarkable resilience of the human spirit.
And her story really leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It does.
The role of chance, the importance of quick thinking and medical expertise, and the unwavering strength of family and love.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly powerful deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring the world with open hearts and curious minds.